The mistake was small, a ghost in the machine of the ledger, but to Zahara the waitress, it screamed louder than the torrential rain hammering against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the private dining room. She stood frozen in her light blue dress, a pitcher of water suspended in her hand like a held breath, her eyes locked on the open document spread across the mahogany table. The room smelled of expensive scotch, rain-dampened wool, and the metallic tang of concealed violence. 3 men sat at the table, but the atmosphere bent entirely around the man in the center. Dae-hyun. He did not look like a criminal. He looked like a king in exile, his charcoal suit tailored to a precision that bordered on surgical, his dark hair swept back from a face that was devastatingly handsome and utterly devoid of mercy. He was currently dragging a fountain pen across the paper, nodding as his lieutenant, a scarred man named Kong, explained the quarterly projections for the shipping logistics. Zahara knew she should pour the water and vanish. She knew that invisibility was her only currency in a place like the Obsidian, a restaurant where the city's monsters came to eat in peace. But the numbers were wrong. They were logically, offensively wrong. The discrepancy gnawed at the compulsively organized architecture of her mind, an itch that bypassed her survival instinct. The yield is steady at 12%, Kong said, his voice rough, a stark contrast to the sterile elegance of the room. The Port Authority fees were higher, but the distribution covered the loss. Dae-hyun didn't look up, his eyes scanning the columns. The pen hovered, ready to sign off on a lie. Zahara's fingers tightened around the handle of the pitcher until her knuckles turned the color of ash. If she spoke, she might die. If she didn't speak, the error would propagate, a chaotic fracture in a perfect system. The compulsion won. "It's not 12%, she whispered, the words slipping out before she could strangle them. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air from the room. Kong stopped mid-sentence. The third man, a bodyguard near the door, shifted his weight, his hand dropping to his jacket. Dae-hyun did not move. He simply stopped the movement of his pen, the nib hovering millimeters above the paper. Slowly, painfully slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and terrifyingly cold as they fixed on her. "Excuse me," his voice was soft, a velvet shroud over a blade. Zahara felt her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, but her mind remained ice-cold, anchored by the math. She stepped forward, the water pitcher trembling slightly. "The amortization on the 3rd column," she said, her voice gaining a fragile strength. "You're calculating the depreciation linearly, but the port fees compound weekly. If you sign that, you're not accepting a 12% yield. You're accepting a 4% loss masked as a break-even." Kong stood up, so fast his chair screeched against the floor, a jagged sound that made Zahara flinch. "You stupid girl," he snarled, stepping toward her, his hand raised as if to strike the insolence out of her. "Get out." Now, Zahara flinched, bracing for the impact, closing her eyes tight. But the blow never came. "Sit down, Kong." The command was quiet, barely above a whisper, but it hit the lieutenant like a physical weight. Dae-hyun hadn't looked away from Zahara. He capped his pen with a sharp click that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. He gestured to the empty chair beside him, a predator inviting a rabbit into its den. "Show me," he said. It wasn't a request. It was a challenge. Zahara swallowed the lump of terror in her throat and set the pitcher down. Her hands, usually rough from scrubbing tables and washing dishes, looked stark against the fine leather of the ledger. She picked up the pen he had discarded. For 20 seconds, the only sound in the room was the scratching of ink on paper and the relentless rhythm of the rain outside. She drew a line through the total, recalculated the compound interest in the margins, and circled the new bottom line. The math flowed through her, a comforting language in a world of chaos. When she finished, she slid the book back to him. Dae-hyun looked at the numbers. He traced her calculations with his eyes, his expression unreadable. Then, the corner of his mouth twitched, not a smile, but a crack in the ice. He looked up at her, really seeing her for the first time, stripping away the waitress uniform and seeing the mind beneath. "What is your name?" he asked. "Zahara," she breathed. "Zahara," he repeated, tasting the syllables. "Get her a coat. She's leaving early." The rain had not let up by the time she was dismissed. It had only intensified, turning the streets of the city into rivers of oil and neon reflections. Zahara did not have a coat, despite the order. She had fled the restaurant the moment the manager, pale and sweating, had told her she was done for the night, pressing a thick envelope of cash into her hand and telling her not to ask questions. She walked quickly toward her apartment, a cramped studio in the crumbling district of the city, clutching her thin cardigan around her chest. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a deep, shivering dread. She had corrected a warlord. She had humiliated his lieutenant. In the movies, this was the part where the girl got away. In reality, she knew she had just walked onto a chessboard she didn't understand. Every pair of headlights that swept over her made her flinch. She kept replaying the scene in her mind, the way Dae-hyun's eyes had narrowed, the predatory focus, the way the air in the room had shifted from dismissal to curiosity. Curiosity from a man like that was not a gift, it was a target designation. She reached her building, a towering soar of concrete and peeling paint, and practically ran up the 4 flights of stairs. Inside her apartment, she locked the door, engaging all 3 deadbolts, though she knew they would offer no resistance to the kind of men who guarded Dae-hyun. She threw the envelope on her small, scarred kitchen table. It burst open, spilling crisp bills, more money than she made in 6 months. She stared at it, her breathing shallow. It wasn't a tip. It was a down payment. Or perhaps it was severance pay for a life about to be cut short. Zahara paced the small room, the walls closing in on her. She stripped off the light blue uniform, needing to shed the skin of the waitress, and pulled on an oversized sweater, seeking comfort. She sat by the window, watching the street below through the cracked blinds. She counted the cars. She calculated the velocity of the raindrops. She organized her fear into variables and probabilities, trying to solve for survival. But the variable she couldn't account for was him. Dae-hyun. Why hadn't he let Kong hurt her? Why had he looked at the numbers with such reverence? The night dragged on, a slow torture of minutes ticking by. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Every creak of the building was a footstep. Every distant siren was a warning. By the time the gray light of dawn began to bleed through the clouds, Zahara was exhausted, her eyes burning, her mind frayed. She went to the kitchen to make tea, her hands shaking. She needed to leave town. She had the money now. She could go to the bus station. She could disappear. She was reaching for her bag when the knock came. It wasn't a pounding, aggressive knock. It was 3 precise, rhythmic taps. Controlled. Inevitable. Zahara froze, the ceramic mug slipping from her fingers and shattering on the floor. The sound was deafening. She backed away until her spine hit the counter. The knock came again. "Miss Zahara?" A voice from the hallway. Calm, professional. "Please open the door." She looked at the fire escape window, rusted shut, painted over by the landlord years ago. She was trapped. With a trembling hand, she unlocked the first bolt. Then the second. Then the third. She opened the door, just a crack. Standing in the hallway was not the scarred lieutenant, Kong, but a younger man in a suit that cost more than her entire building. He wore sunglasses, despite the gloom of the hallway. "Mr. Park requires your assistance," the man said. He didn't say invites. He didn't say asks. He said requires. Behind him, 2 other men stood like statues. There was no choice. There never had been. Zahara nodded, defeat slumping her shoulders. "Let me get my shoes," she whispered. The ride was a blur of silence and speed. They had ushered her into the back of a black SUV with tinted windows, so dark the world outside looked like a bruised twilight. The interior smelled of leather and ozone. Zahara sat in the middle, flanked by the silent sentinels. She didn't ask where they were going. She knew the geography of power in this city. They were heading downtown, to the Steel District, where the skyscrapers pierced the clouds like needles. She tried to calculate the route, tracking the turns, the acceleration, the deceleration, building a map in her head in case she needed to run. But the logic was failing her. Her mind kept drifting back to the image of Dae-hyun's hand on the ledger. It was a hand capable of violence, yet it had held the pen with the grace of a calligrapher. He was a paradox, and paradoxes were dangerous. They couldn't be solved, only endured. The car slowed, the tires crunching over gravel, then humming over smooth concrete as they descended into an underground garage. The sudden darkness of the tunnel triggered a spike of panic. This was how people vanished. Buried under concrete, erased from the equation. The car stopped. The door opened. "This way, please," the young man gestured toward a private elevator that stood alone in the center of the garage, bathed in harsh white light. Zahara stepped out, her legs feeling like water. She was wearing her worn sneakers and jeans now, a stark contrast to the corporate armor of her captors. They didn't follow her into the elevator. The young man simply pressed a key card against the panel and hit the button for the penthouse. The door slid shut, sealing her in a silver box. The ascent was rapid. Her ears popped. 10 floors. 20. 40. The numbers on the display climbed higher, counting down the seconds until she faced him again. She caught her reflection in the polished steel doors. She looked small, fragile, but her eyes were sharp. She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. She was not a soldier, but she was a mathematician. She understood that even the most chaotic systems had rules. If she could find the rules of Daehyun's world, she could survive it. The elevator slowed. The bell chimed, a cheerful, mundane sound that felt grotesque given the circumstances. The doors opened. She stepped directly into a space that was less an office and more a cathedral of glass and shadow. The walls were sheer windows, revealing the sprawling, gray city far below, looking like a circuit board of wet concrete. The ceiling was high, lost in gloom. The only light came from the gray daylight filtering through the rain and a single, low lamp on a massive desk at the far end of the room. The air was frigid, climate-controlled to a sterile chill. Daehyun was standing by the window, his back to her, looking out at the empire he likely controlled. He had discarded his jacket. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were corded with muscle. He didn't turn around when she entered. He let her stand there, let the silence stretch and warp until it was almost unbearable. It was a power move. He was controlling the tempo. Zahara refused to fidget. She stood perfectly still, clutching her bag, waiting. "Most people," he said, his voice carrying perfectly across the vast room without him raising it, "see numbers as abstract concepts. Tools for trade." He turned slowly, his silhouette dark against the gray sky. "You see them as truth." He walked toward his desk, his movements fluid, predatory. He didn't ask her to sit. He picked up a thick, black folder and dropped it onto the glass surface. The sound was heavy, final. "My accountant has been with me for 10 years. He has an MBA from Harvard and a survival instinct that should have kept him honest." Daehyun rested his hands on the desk, leaning forward, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "But you found a hole in his logic in 30 seconds while pouring water." He tapped the folder. "This is the raw data for my construction holdings. There is a leak. Money is bleeding out, and the books balance perfectly. It's a magic trick." He straightened up, crossing his arms. "I don't need a waitress, Zahara. And I don't need a gangster. I need a mind that cannot be lied to." He gestured to the folder. "Find the leak. You have an hour. If you find it, you leave here with a job that pays more in a month than you make in a decade. If you don't..." He let the sentence hang there, unfinished, the threat implicit in the silence. "Then I will assume yesterday was a fluke, and I do not tolerate wasting my time." Zahara looked at the folder, then at him. The fear was still there, buzzing in her veins, but something else was rising to meet it, the challenge, the puzzle. He was testing her. He was offering her a way out of the trap, but the price was her mind. She walked to the desk, placed her bag on the floor, and opened the file. "I'll need a calculator," she said, her voice steady. "And a cup of tea." Daehyun's lips curved into that same terrifying ghost of a smile. "Get her the tea," he said to the empty air, and she knew, with a chill, that they were being watched. The tea arrived on a lacquer tray, brought by a shadow of a woman who moved without sound, placing the porcelain cup beside the sprawling mess of documents Zahara had created. Zahara didn't look up. She was already submerged, drowning in the ocean of data that Daehyun had spilled before her. The numbers were not just ink on paper. They were a topographical map of a crime in progress, a landscape of hidden valleys and artificial peaks designed to hide a massive hemorrhage of capital. The room remained aggressively silent, save for the rhythmic drumming of rain against the glass, a sound that matched the ticking of the invisible clock hanging over her head. Dae-hyun had returned to the window, his silhouette cut from the gray light, watching the storm, but Zahara could feel the weight of his attention on the back of her neck. It was a physical pressure, heavy and electric, like the air before a lightning strike. She forced herself to ignore him, to reduce him to a variable she couldn't control, and focused on the variables she could. The leak wasn't simple theft, it was elegant. It was a fractal fraud, a tiny rounding error in the procurement logs for steel beams that multiplied across 1,000 shell transactions. It was beautiful in its construction, a mathematical parasite feeding on the host. Her mind raced, dismantling the structure, tracing the digital breadcrumbs through layers of corporate obfuscation. Minutes bled into one another. Her tea went cold, untouched. The sheer audacity of the embezzlement made her breath hitch. Whoever had done this wasn't just greedy. They were arrogant. They believed no one would ever look this close. They hadn't accounted for a waitress who saw the world in patterns. As the hour mark approached, Zahara circled the final node in the network. She dropped the pen. The sound was a sharp crack in the silence. Dae-hyun turned immediately, as if he had been waiting for that exact frequency. "Time is up," he said, his voice devoid of inflection. Zahara stood, her legs trembling slightly from the adrenaline crash. She didn't pick up the folder. She didn't need to. The map was burned into her eidetic memory. She walked around the desk, encroaching on his space, violating the unspoken boundary between the predator and the prey. If she was right, she was valuable. If she was wrong, she was dead. "It's not a leak," she said, her voice finding a steel core she didn't know she possessed. "It's a siphon. And it's not external." Dae-hyun didn't blink. He walked toward her, closing the distance until he was standing less than a foot away, looming over her. The scent of him, sandalwood, rain, and cold iron, flooded her senses. "Explain," he commanded softly. Zahara reached past him, her hand hovering over the open file on his desk, pointing to a column of serial numbers. "The steel procurement for the North Side development. The vendor is a subsidiary of a holding company listed in the Caymans, but the routing numbers for the payments loop back to a domestic account." She looked up, meeting his dark, abyssal gaze. "The account is registered to a cipher, but the authorization codes match the ones used for your personal security detail." The implication hung in the air, toxic and heavy. She was telling him that the knife in his back was being held by his own guard. Specifically, the patterns matched the authorization level of Kong, the man who had almost struck her the night before. Dae-hyun looked down at where her finger rested on the paper. He was silent for a long, terrifying moment. He wasn't looking at the numbers anymore. He was processing the betrayal. His expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You're certain?" he asked, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in her chest. "The math doesn't lie," she whispered. "People lie. Numbers just wait to be found." Dae-hyun moved with a sudden, violent grace, bypassing the desk and picking up the phone receiver. He punched a single button. "Bring him to me," that was all he said. He hung up and turned back to Zahara, his eyes blazing with a cold, terrifying light. It wasn't anger, it was something far worse, clarity. He looked at her as if she were a rare artifact he had unearthed from the mud. "You have a dangerous mind, Zahara," he murmured, stepping closer until she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. Most people would have stopped at the discrepancy. "You followed the blood trail." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, and for a second, she thought he might strike her, a reflex of the violence she had just unveiled. Instead, his thumb brushed her cheekbone, a touch that was shockingly gentle yet possessive. "You just saved me $20 million, he said, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "And you cost a man his life." Zahara shuddered, the reality of his words crashing into her. She had treated it like a puzzle, a logic game. But in this room, on this level of the city, logic had a body count. "I just fixed the equation," she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't write the rules." Dae-hyun's eyes narrowed slightly, intrigued by her defiance. "No," he agreed. But you play by them now, the elevator chimed. The sound was cheerful, discordant. Dae-hyun's hand dropped from her face. His demeanor shifted instantly from intimate investigator to warlord. Stand behind me, he ordered. It wasn't a suggestion. Zahara retreated to the shadow of the bookshelf just as the elevator doors slid open. Kong stepped out, looking arrogant, annoyed, unaware that he was walking into a tomb. The confrontation was brief, brutal, and entirely devoid of shouting. Dae-hyun did not scream. He did not accuse. He simply slid the file across the glass desk toward his lieutenant. Kong looked at the open ledger, at the circled routing numbers, and the color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse standing upright. He looked up, his eyes darting to where Zahara stood in the shadows. Boss, Kong started, his voice cracking. I can explain. The liquidity was... Dae-hyun raised a hand, cutting off the lie before it could fully form. Zahara, Dae-hyun said, not taking his eyes off the traitor. Tell him the yield variance on his theft. Zahara stepped forward, her heart pounding against her ribs like a sledgehammer. She felt like an executioner's assistant. The loop siphons 4% of the gross construction budget weekly, she recited, her voice robotic with fear. Compounded over 6 months, the total loss is 22 million. Kong stared at her with pure hatred, but the fear of Dae-hyun paralyzed him. Dae-hyun nodded slowly. You stole from me, Kong. That is disappointing. But you did it so poorly that a waitress caught you in an hour. That is insulting. Dae-hyun gestured to the 2 guards who had emerged from the service entrance, silent specters in the room. They moved on Kong instantly. There was no struggle. Kong knew the rules. As they dragged him toward the elevator, he didn't beg. He just stared at the floor, accepting the crushing inevitability of the math. When the doors closed, leaving them alone again, the silence that rushed back into the room was heavy, suffocating. Zahara felt faint. She gripped the edge of a bookshelf to steady herself. She had just signed a death warrant with a calculator. Dae-hyun turned to her, his movements slow, deliberate. The violence had been outsourced, but the threat remained in the room, coiled around him. He walked to a side cabinet and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. He walked over to her, extending 1 glass. Drink, he said. Zahara took it, her fingers brushing his. The glass was heavy crystal. She took a sip. The scotch burned all the way down, grounding her, burning away the shock. Why? She asked, the words slipping out. Why did you make me do it? You have accountants. Dae-hyun took a sip of his own drink, watching her over the rim. Loyalty is expensive, he said. Competence is rare. But a mind that seeks truth regardless of consequence? That is priceless. He set his glass down on a stack of books and leaned against the shelf, trapping her in the corner, not with his body, but with his presence. You are wasting away in that restaurant, Zahara. Serving water to men who can't count. You live in a studio apartment with 3 locks on the door because you are afraid of the world. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, his voice dropping to a seductive, dark whisper. I am offering you a different kind of fear. The fear of power. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a black card, heavy and metallic. He slipped it into the pocket of her oversized sweater. You don't work for the restaurant anymore. You work for me. You will audit every branch of my organization. You will find every leak, every lie, every weakness. Zahara looked up at him, her breathing shallow. And if I say no? Dae-hyun smiled, and this time, it reached his eyes. It was a dark, dangerous smile, but it was genuine. You won't, he said with absolute certainty, because you are already bored with the safety of your small life. You solved the puzzle because you couldn't help yourself. You belong here in the storm, he was right. God help her, he was right. The adrenaline coursing through her wasn't just fear, it was exhilaration. She had spent her life hiding her intelligence, dumbing herself down to survive. Here it was a weapon. It was currency. I want an office, she said, her voice trembling but clear. And I want access to everything. No redacted files. Dae-hyun's smile widened. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. Done, he straightened up and walked back to his desk, picking up the phone again. My driver is waiting downstairs. He will take you to your new apartment. The keys are in the car. Zahara blinked, the speed of the transition making her dizzy. New apartment. Dae-hyun didn't look up from the documents. He was already reviewing her work. You cannot be my auditor and live in a building with broken locks. It reflects poorly on my assets, he paused, then looked at her one last time, his gaze sweeping over her with a possessive intensity that made her knees weak. Go, Zahara. Get some sleep. Tomorrow, we tear the shipping division apart. She turned to leave, clutching her bag, her mind reeling. She walked to the elevator, the heavy carpet swallowing the sound of her sneakers. She pressed the button, and as the door slid open, she looked back. Dae-hyun was watching her, standing amidst the glass and the gray light, the king of a dark kingdom. He raised his glass in a silent toast. The doors closed, sealing her in. But this time, she wasn't trapped. She was ascending. The car ride was different this time. The driver spoke to her with deference. Ms. Zahara, we are arriving at the spire. She looked out the window as the car pulled up to a sleek, modern glass tower, miles away from her crumbling neighborhood. The doorman held the door open. The concierge handed her an envelope. Inside was a key card and a single piece of paper. She took the elevator up, not to the penthouse, but to the floor just below it. She opened the door to an apartment that was vast, minimalist, and breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the city, mirroring the view from Dae-hyun's office. On the kitchen island, there was a box wrapped in black velvet. Zahara walked over to it, her heart hammering. She opened the lid. Inside was a platinum fountain pen, identical to the one she had used to correct the ledger, and a note written in elegant, sharp handwriting. The math was never the mistake. The mistake was thinking you were just a waitress. She picked up the pen, feeling its weight, its balance. She walked to the window and looked out at the rain-soaked city. It looked different now. It didn't look like a threat. It looked like a problem waiting to be solved. And she had the pen.